Deep in the hills of eastern Washington, a team fed a camera on a steel cable down into a pit that is supposed to have no bottom. They stopped the reel at 1,000 feet. What came back on that footage sent them off the property before they had even finished watching it. Nobody has released the full recording since. I'm Ambrose Wild, and I want to walk you through this one carefully, because the story of Mel's hole is easy to laugh off and much harder to explain once you actually sit with the details. The laugh is the trap. The details are where it gets uncomfortable. Start with where this thing sits, because the location is the one part everyone agrees on. Ranch country west of a small city called Ellensburg, up along Monastash Ridge in Kittitas County. Dry grass, basalt, cattle. The kind of open land where a hole in the ground would just be a hole in the ground. From above it looks like an old well, a rough circle maybe 9 feet across, ringed by a wall of stones stacked without mortar that drops about 15 feet before the light gives out and the dark takes over completely. For decades, the people who lived out there used it the way rural people use any deep hole. They threw things in. Household trash, dead appliances, worn tires, a broken refrigerator, whatever needed to disappear. And here is the first thing that should not sit right with you. No matter how much went down, the level never rose. A well fills, a pit fills. This one swallowed everything and stayed empty, which is not how holes work. The man who owned the land, Mel Waters, noticed something stranger than the appetite. There was no sound. Drop a tire down a 15-foot well and you hear it hit. Drop it down this and you hear nothing at all. No impact, no echo, no scrape of metal on rock. Just silence closing over the top like water. That silence is worth stopping on, because it is the detail that quietly breaks the easy explanations. Sound needs a surface to bounce off. A 1,000-foot shaft would still return something, a delayed thud, a faint ring, anything. A hole that eats sound entirely is either impossibly deep, or it is doing something to the air inside it that we do not have a clean word for. Neither answer is comfortable, and that discomfort is the engine of this whole story. Mel was a fisherman, so he did what a fisherman would do. He reached for a reel. He tied a 1-pound weight to a fishing line and let it run, waiting for the line to go slack the way it does when a sinker touches bottom. It never went slack. He spooled out 4,500 feet, nearly a mile, and the weight was still pulling straight down into nothing. So he added line, then more. According to the story, he kept splicing spools together until he had fed something like 80,000 feet into the earth. That is over 15 miles of line, straight down, and the weight had still not found a flaw. Now hold that number against what geology allows, because this is where a careful viewer should push back, and I want to push back with you. An unlined shaft in rock cannot stay open at that depth. The pressure would close it, the walls would collapse, the whole thing would seal itself long before you reached a fraction of that. Which means one of two things is true. Either the number is a tall tale that grew in the telling, or we are not looking at an ordinary hole in ordinary rock. The story refuses to let you settle on the comfortable option, and it does that on purpose. But the depth was never the strangest part. The animals were. Mel's dogs would not go near the rim. They would dig their paws into the dirt, pull back against the leash, and refuse, the way a dog refuses a vet's table or a thunderstorm. And it was not just his dogs. When he asked around, every neighbor with a dog said the same thing. Something about that ground read as wrong to them. The birds, though, did the opposite. They flew straight over it without a flicker of concern, As if from the air, the hole simply was not there. Only at ground level did the wrongness switch on. Stand at the edge, and the ordinary noise of a Washington field goes quiet. No insects working the grass, no birdsong nearby. A pocket of silence sitting on top of the silence in the pit. And then there is the story I sat with the longest, because it is the one that turns a strange hole into something out of a nightmare. A neighbour's dog had died. Grieving, not wanting to dig a grave, the man lowered the body into the pit. A few days later, that same dog was moving through the woods near his property. Same markings, same collar. Alive. He called its name, and it looked at him with no recognition at all, then turned and kept walking, as if whatever had come back up wearing his dog's face had never known him. I am not asking you to believe that. I am asking you to notice what it does to you when you picture it, because that reaction is exactly why this legend has outlived nearly every other one from its era. Now, everything I have told you so far lived quietly on one ranch for years. What blew it open was a radio broadcast, and the way it blew open is the smartest, saddest part of the entire case. Because there was one more anomaly Mel kept running into. Radios acted strangely near the pit. Bring a receiver close and it would hiss, drift, and then lock onto stations it had no business receiving. Broadcasts from far away. Broadcasts, people claimed, from years in the past. An old baseball game, music from decades gone, bleeding through the static as if the whole were pulling signal out of time itself. And this is where I want to be fair to the skeptic and the believer at the same time, because the radio detail cuts both ways, and most retellings miss that. There is a mundane version of this. On certain nights, radio waves bounce off a charged layer of the upper atmosphere and skip enormous distances. So a receiver in Washington genuinely can pull a station from half a continent away. Ham operators chase exactly this. A deep shaft in iron-rich basalt could plausibly behave like an antenna and make it worse. That is a real explanation, and it covers the distant stations cleanly. What it does not cover is the claim that the signal was old, a game that was played years before it came through the static. Skip propagation moves a signal across space. It does not reach back through time. So if the ordinary explanation is right, the broadcast from the past was a man mishearing an oldie station on a bad night. And if that part was real, we are back to needing a word we do not have. The case keeps handing you one door that closes and one that stays open, side by side, over and over. Overwhelmed and out of his depth, Mel took the story to the one place in America built for exactly this. In 1997, he called into Coast to Coast AM, the overnight radio show hosted by Art Bell, broadcast out of the Nevada desert to millions of listeners who tuned in specifically for the unexplained. He told the whole thing on air. The depth, the silence, the dogs, the dog that came back. And the response was enormous. Callers phoned in with theories, with instructions, with warnings. Use a laser to measure the depth. Use ground-penetrating radar. It sits on a ley line, an invisible seam of energy across the planet. It is a doorway to another place or another time. It is an entrance to a hollow interior of the earth. The legend went global in a single night. But sharing the story cost Mel the thing that mattered. On the air, walking through where the pit was, he named the region. He gave away the county, the landmarks, enough for anyone determined to find it. That single act, saying out loud where the land was, is the pivot the whole story turns on. Because the next day, he could not get back onto his own property. The way he told it, the United States military had moved in overnight. Vehicles across the access road, armed personnel turning him away, helicopters working the airspace over his land and not stopping. When he demanded a reason, he was told a plane had crashed on his property and the site was sealed for investigation. But there was no wreckage, no burn scar, no debris, no smoke, nothing a crash leaves behind. Just a cordon around a hole and a man in plain clothes who came out to meet him. That man did not talk like an accident investigator. He hinted the land might not be Mel's anymore. He suggested that if Mel made trouble, inconvenient things might be found on the property, the kind of things that put a man in prison. Mel said he would go to the press. The man told him to go ahead, because no one on earth would believe a word of it. And the cruel part is that he was almost right. The story was too strange to be taken seriously, which made it the perfect thing to make disappear. What happened to Mel afterward reads like the story protecting its own mystery. He claimed he was eventually offered an enormous sum, millions a year, to lease the land on 3 conditions. Say nothing, leave the country, never come back. He took it and moved to Australia. Then, homesick, he slipped back to see family and things came apart. A blackout on a bus. 12 days he could not account for. Waking in an alley in San Francisco with his wallet gone, needle marks in his arm, teeth missing, no memory of how any of it happened. His money vanished, his property gone on paper. And then, eventually, Mel himself went quiet. The calls stopped. The line went dead. No one heard from him again. And there is a chapter most people never even hear, because it happens after the disappearance, and it is the strangest of all. Before he went silent for good, Mel described being contacted by a community of sheep herders in Nevada, families who had come from the border country between France and Spain generations back. They had their own hole. Older than living memory, they said, rings not with stone, but with a smooth metal band running down into the dark. A hole they treated as sacred and had guarded for 200 years. They wanted the one man alive who might understand it. This one behaved differently, and the difference is the detail that makes my skin crawl. It was warm. Drop a tool against the metal ring, and the sound simply vanished. The same acoustic wrongness as the Washington pit, but this time paired with heat coming up out of the ground. They ran an experiment. They lowered a bucket of ice down about 1,000 feet, left an identical bucket on the surface, and waited. The surface ice melted like ice does. The ice from the hole came back up dry, no longer cold, changed into something that looked like chunks of salt. And when they tried to melt those chunks with a flame, they did not melt. They caught fire, and they burned for months without going out, pulling every trace of moisture out of the air around them. Then they lowered a sheep. When the box came back up, the animal was dead, and inside it the herders found something that had no right to be there. Tissue that looked cooked, and a mass that was moving on its own. I will leave the rest of what they described where it belongs, in the realm of things that cannot be checked and should not be dwelt on. What matters is what the story does here. It escalates past strange, past frightening, into the genuinely impossible. And it does it right at the point where a hoaxer looking for credibility would have pulled back. That choice, to get less believable rather than more, is either a storyteller with no commercial instinct at all, or a man describing something he could not make fit any frame he had. Neither reading is simple. If you are finding this as strange and as gripping as I am, take a second to subscribe, because I go deep on unexplained cases like this one every week, and the next few are just as hard to put down. Now, let's get to the part where we stop taking the story at its word and start checking it. Because here is where I have to be honest with you, and where the story gets genuinely interesting instead of just spooky. Almost none of it can be verified, and the gaps are specific. Start with the most damning one. In all these years, across every retelling, there is not a single photograph of the pit. Not one. Every time Art Bell asked for a picture, Mel had a reason. He forgot the camera. The cameras malfunctioned near the hole because of interference. He had photos, but not on hand. He would send them later, and later never came. For a man with the most extraordinary thing in North America sitting on his land, the total absence of a single image is the loudest silence in the whole case. Then the paper trail, or the lack of one. Researchers went looking for property records for a Mel Waters in that part of Kittitas County. They did not find him. No deed, no listing, no trace of the name owning land where the land was said to be. Maybe an alias to protect his privacy, which is possible, or maybe a man who was never quite there to begin with. Which brings us to the piece the believers point to hardest, the blacked out square. For a while, a satellite imaging service showed a censored tile, a black rectangle over roughly the area the pit was said to occupy. Proof of a cover-up, the story goes. Except the timing does not cooperate. That censored imagery did not appear until months after Mel's first call to the show, which means it cannot be the thing that inspired the story, and it just as easily could be an ordinary imaging gap that the legend reached out and absorbed, the way this legend absorbs everything near it. Put the geology and the gaps together and the rational verdict is clear. A hole that goes down 15 miles without collapsing does not exist. A story with no photograph, no record, and no verifiable owner is a story, not a place. By every ordinary standard, this should be closed. But here is why it will not close, and it is worth understanding even if you are the biggest skeptic watching. Mel never sold it. He could have printed t-shirts, books, fake photographs, a paid tour. People were desperate to give him money for it. He took none of that. And for 5 years, under real pressure from a host who knew how to catch people out, his story did not wander. The details he gave in year 5 matched the details from year 1. Liars usually improve their material. He never did. That does not make any of it true, but it is not the profile of a simple hoax, and that is precisely the crack the mystery lives in. In 2017, a group that could not let it go went looking. They had coordinates pulled off the internet, GoPros and heavy lights, and they found a ranch and a dark opening in the ground that matched the description. They threw rocks and listened for a bottom that did not answer. And the whole time they felt it, that sense every person in this story eventually describes of being watched from somewhere at the edge of the property. They filmed everything. Then, before they had even reviewed the footage, the feeling got strong enough that they packed up and left. The last thing one of them saw was a single beetle walking over the lip of the hole and dropping into the dark, swallowed the same way the tires and the trash and the story itself were swallowed, without a sound. So where does that leave us? The skeptic in me says there is no pit 15 miles deep, no dog reborn, no doorway under a cattle ranch, and the total absence of a photograph settles it. But sit with the other side for a second, because it is sharper than it looks. Every anomaly in this case, the missing photos, the vanished records, the erased map tile, the disappeared owner, is also exactly what you would expect to find if someone genuinely wanted a place to stop existing. The absence of proof is doing double duty here. It is either the sign there was never anything to find, or the sign that something was very carefully unfound. And there is no clean way from where we sit to tell those two apart. That is not a flaw in the story, that is the whole trick of it. Maybe Mel's hole is a campfire tale that a radio show set loose on the world one night in 1997 and never reeled back in. Or maybe there is a dry stacked ring of stones on a ridge in Washington, fenced off and wiped from the record, still quietly eating everything that goes near it. I know which answer is likelier. I am just no longer completely sure it is the right one. I'm Ambrose Wild. If a bottomless pit that swallows dogs and dodges the map is the kind of thing that keeps you up a little, stick around, because there are more of these waiting. Cases just as strange and just as stubborn, and I take on a new one every week. The next hole we look into might be one nobody warned you about yet.